Have you ever believed in a single moment? A moment that can rip apart the veil of reality, forever changing the course of millions of lives? In just a split second. On the night of April 26, 1986, in the small town of Pripyat, such a moment occurred. Hundreds of thousands of people were living in peace, completely unaware that their fate was less than 3 kilometers away. A terrifying reality was waiting. Suddenly, a blinding cold blue light tore through the night. There was no earth-shattering explosion, no tremors that toppled buildings. Just a strange light and a small tremor, brief, almost imperceptible. And in that moment, an invisible enemy was unleashed. An enemy without smell, without color, that cannot be seen with the naked eye. It has a destructive power greater than any weapon ever created. It permeated the earth, the water, the air, and finally every cell in the human body. But the most terrifying thing was not just the explosion. It was the deadly silence that followed. 36 hours. 36 hours of silent panic. 36 hours of a race against death. When the evacuation order was finally given, they left with small bags, with faint hopes, believing they would return in 3 days. But no one ever came back. This story is not just about a nuclear disaster. It is about the nature of humanity when faced with an invisible death. It's about the fine line between scientific power and destruction, and about the price of a hidden truth. Can we truly control this destructive energy? Or are we just powerless pawns on a chessboard of destiny? Will there be another Chernobyl in the future? One moment, one secret, one world forgotten. Chernobyl, the story of fate. Lessons from Chernobyl. Then and now. After unimaginable pain, haunting silence, and losses beyond comprehension, the story of Chernobyl has not ended. It is not just a past disaster, but a living legacy, a permanent warning etched into the collective memory of humanity. Chernobyl is a symbol of human fragility in the face of technology's power, the consequences of arrogance and irresponsibility, and the incredible ability to recover when we confront our mistakes. Today, we will look back at Chernobyl's legacy, from the extraordinary engineering feats to the lessons that continue to shape how we approach the future of energy and global responsibility. One of the clearest symbols of Chernobyl's legacy is Reactor 4, now enclosed in a monumental engineering structure. New safe confinement. After the 1986 explosion, the destroyed reactor was temporarily covered by a concrete structure called the sarcophagus. Hastily built by thousands of liquidators under harsh conditions. However, by the 1990s, this structure began to seriously degrade, with cracks allowing radiation to leak and a risk of collapse that threatened to spread more cesium-137 and strontium-90 into the environment. According to an IAEA report from 2000, the original sarcophagus was only designed to last for 20 to 30 years, and its replacement became an international priority. In 2016, after almost 2 decades of planning and construction, the new safe confinement, massive steel arch weighing 36,000 tons, 108 meters high and 162 meters long, was completed and slid into position over the reactor. At a cost of 2.1 billion euros, funded by over 40 countries and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The NSC is the largest land-based structure ever moved. It was designed to prevent radiation leaks for at least 100 years, while also allowing for the safe dismantling of the reactor in the future. According to Ukraine's state agency for the management of the exclusion zone, the NSC has reduced the radiation emitted from the area to 1/10 of what it was before 2016, marking a major step in controlling the disaster's aftermath. However, it is also a painful reminder. Even with the most advanced technology, humanity can only contain but not completely erase Chernobyl's radioactive legacy. Isotopes like cesium-137 and plutonium-239 will continue to exist in the ground, making the area around the reactor an exclusion zone for centuries, if not millennia. Meanwhile, the ghost city of Pripyat, once the jewel of the Soviet Union, with a population of nearly 50,000 people, is now a living testament to the tragedy. The iconic Ferris wheel in the amusement park, which was never used, still stands among the wild trees. Schools with dusty books, apartments filled with abandoned children's toys, and faded propaganda posters on the walls bear witness to a life that was abruptly interrupted. According to a 2023 UNESCO report, the 2,600 square kilometers Chernobyl exclusion zone has become a reverse cultural heritage site, a place that not only preserves the memory of the disaster, but also serves as a warning. It's about the consequences of technology management failures. Pripyat is not just an abandoned city, but an open-air museum where nature is slowly reclaiming control, with wolves, bears, and eagles living among the ruins, but also carrying genetic mutations due to radiation, according to a 2022 study by the University of South Carolina. Chernobyl left behind not only physical structures and desolate lands, but also a series of profound lessons that shape how humanity approaches nuclear energy and crisis management. The disaster exposed human fragility in the face of nuclear power, especially when combined with a lack of transparency, poor engineering design, and a bureaucratic management culture. An IAEA report from 1986 stated that Chernobyl's BMK reactor had many design flaws, such as a lack of passive safety systems and graphite control rods that could easily cause reactor instability. However, it was human irresponsibility, from ignoring safety protocols during the fateful test to concealing information after the explosion, that turned an incident into a global catastrophe. One of the biggest lessons from Chernobyl is the importance of transparency and a rapid response. The delay in publicly disclosing the disaster led to millions of people in Ukraine, Belarus, and Europe being exposed to unnecessary radiation. If potassium iodide pills had been distributed within the first 24 hours, the rate of thyroid cancer in children could have been reduced by up to 70%, according to the WHO in 2006. This lesson led to the creation of international protocols, such as the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident and the Convention on Nuclear Safety by the IAEA, which require countries to share information about nuclear incidents within 24 hours. These regulations proved effective in later events, such as the leak at the Tokomura plant in Japan in 1999, when information was quickly made public to protect the population. However, the lessons from Chernobyl are not limited to nuclear energy.
The Fukushima
Daiichi disaster in Japan in 2011, triggered by an earthquake and tsunami, showed that even technologically advanced nations are not immune to mistakes. Although Fukushima's radiation scale was smaller, the delays in initial evacuation and notification drew comparisons to Chernobyl. A 2020 study from the University of Tokyo found that the lack of coordination between the TEPCO company and the Japanese government increased exposure for 150,000 residents in the area. Fukushima reinforced Chernobyl's lesson. It's not just about safe design, but also about a transparent, effective crisis management system that puts people above political or economic interests. Chernobyl also raises a bigger question about whether humanity can truly master nuclear energy, a powerful but risky source. Today, as the world faces a climate crisis, nuclear energy is hailed as a clean solution to replace fossil fuels. According to the IES 2024 World Energy Outlook, nuclear power currently accounts for 10% of global electricity generation, with countries like France and China expanding new plants. However, Chernobyl is a reminder that the price of a mistake is too high. 5 to 7 million people directly affected, thousands of cancer cases, and a vast area of land uninhabitable for hundreds of years. Critics, like Greenpeace, argue that renewable energy sources such as wind and solar are safer and more sustainable. Meanwhile, nuclear supporters, like the World Nuclear Association, claim that new generation reactors have superior safety designs. This debate is ongoing, but Chernobyl taught us that any decision about nuclear energy must come with absolute responsibility. More than just physical structures or technical lessons, Chernobyl left a spiritual legacy, a deep scar on humanity's collective memory. For the people of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, The disaster is a symbol of betrayal by a political system that prioritized image over human lives. According to a 2025 survey by the Levada Center, 65% of people in the affected areas still express a loss of trust in state institutions regarding crisis management. In Ukraine, Chernobyl contributed to the independence movement from the Soviet Union, as people realized that Moscow was willing to sacrifice them to protect its national reputation. On a global scale, Chernobyl became a cautionary tale, retold through books, films, and tours of the exclusion zone, which attracted over 100,000 tourists annually before the 2022 Russo-Ukraine War, according to Ukraine's tourism agency. The TV series Chernobyl brought the disaster back into the spotlight, emphasizing the role of truth and accountability. But it also raises the question, are we forgetting these lessons? In the context of climate change, war, and new technologies like artificial intelligence or gene editing, Chernobyl reminds us that any human progress must be accompanied by humility and vigilance. Chernobyl is not just a disaster from 1986, but an ongoing story that challenges us to face difficult questions. Has humanity become wise enough to master nuclear energy? Or are we on a path to new mistakes? Can transparency and responsibility prevent a future disaster? Or will we again be tempted by arrogance and short-term gains? The lessons from Chernobyl about safety, transparency, and compassion apply not only to nuclear energy, but to any technology with the potential to change the world from AI to bioenergy. The human cost of an invisible disaster. When the fire sirens fell silent, when the once bright streets were plunged into a quiet darkness, and when the truth about the Chernobyl disaster was still hidden behind a curtain of power, the story did not end. Instead, it opened a new, more painful, more humane, and more haunting chapter. This is no longer a story about burning reactors or cold technical failures. This is a story about people, those who sacrificed, those who lost, and those who were forgotten. This is the story of the human price paid for an invisible disaster. A price measured not only in blood and tears, but also in the emotional scars that linger through generations. Immediately after the horrific explosion at Reactor 4 on April 26, 1986, the Soviet government mobilized a massive force to deal with the disaster, known as the Liquidators. According to declassified Soviet archives, in a 2006 IAEA report, approximately 600,000 to 800,000 people, from firefighters, soldiers, construction workers, miners, engineers, doctors, to volunteers were summoned from all over the Soviet republics to venture into the dead zone. They were tasked with extinguishing the radioactive fire, clearing contaminated debris, building the sarcophagus to enclose the reactor, and preventing the spread of radioactive dust. But most of them were not fully warned about the deadly danger they faced, and many paid with their lives, health, and future. Among the liquidators were young men fresh out of school, conscripted soldiers called in from distant barracks. They entered the contaminated area with minimal protective gear, sometimes just a cloth mask, rubber gloves, and thin leather boots not enough to protect against penetrating gamma radiation or radioactive dust containing cesium-137 and strontium-90. According to the memoirs of Colonel Viktor Kabenik, one of the first fire commanders on the scene, many young soldiers were not given personal dosimeters and were only ordered to do it quickly and get out. They had to dig contaminated soil, move hot graphite blocks from the reactor core, and even scrub buildings to remove radioactive dust. Some were only allowed to work for a few minutes per shift to minimize exposure, but the accumulated dose was still enough to cause acute or chronic illness. One of the most horrifying tasks was clearing the roof of Reactor 3, adjacent to Reactor 4, where radioactive graphite and uranium fuel fragments had rained down after the explosion, known as Matia's roof by the liquidators. This area had radiation levels of up to 1,000,000,000 rontgens per hour, the equivalent of a lethal dose in just a few minutes. Remote-controlled robots, like the Joker robot supplied by Germany, were deployed for the cleanup, but they quickly failed due to the extremely high radiation burning out their electronic circuits. With no other option, the Soviet authorities were forced to use humans. Young soldiers, bitterly referred to as biorobots, were mobilized. They wore 30 kilograms lead armor, rushed onto the roof in 60 to 90-second shifts, used shovels to scoop up radioactive fragments, and threw them down into the damaged reactor. Each person was only allowed 1 or 2 shifts before being replaced, but the radiation dose they received, often 100 to 500 MSV each time, far exceeded safe limits. A 2006 report estimated that approximately 240,000 liquidators who worked in the most dangerous area, from 1,986, 1,987, received an average dose of 100 MSV, with 20% of them receiving over 250 MSV, enough to increase their cancer risk by 2 to 5 times compared to the general population. The story of the liquidators is not just about sacrifice, but also about deception. Many were not fully informed of the risks, and some were even forced to participate with promises of bonuses or privileges like free housing. According to a 2011 study by the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, over 60% of surveyed liquidators said they did not receive clear information about radiation before their mission, and 30% said they were threatened with disciplinary action if they refused. The consequences were catastrophic. A 2008 UNCIA report estimated that at least 4,000 liquidators died within 20 years of the disaster, from radiation-related illnesses, such as blood cancer, lung cancer, and heart failure. The survivors, like engineer Alexei Ananenko, one of 3 men who dove into the contaminated water pool under the reactor, to open a relief valve and prevent a second explosion, had to live with chronic illnesses and psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. Although honored belatedly, many liquidators felt abandoned, with medical and financial aid from the Russian and Ukrainian governments often being insufficient to support them. The human cost of Chernobyl lies not only with those who directly fought the disaster, but also with the residents of Pripyat, a modern, prosperous city built to serve the nuclear power plant. With a population of 49,360 in 1986, Pripyat was once a symbol of the Soviet dream: spacious apartment buildings, modern schools, and a sparkling amusement park. But in just 36 hours after the explosion, the entire city was abandoned, becoming a haunting ghost town where time seemed to stand still. Residents were ordered to evacuate at noon on April 27th, with the announcement that they would return in a few days. They carried a few clothes, personal documents, and small keepsakes, unaware that they would never be allowed to return. The loss of Pripyat was not just about homes or possessions. It was the theft of an entire life, a homeland, and precious memories. Families who celebrated birthdays in cozy apartments, children who played in playgrounds, and couples who dated under the famous Ferris wheel lights-all were erased in a single night. According to a 2020 study from Kitamohila University, over 80% of former Pripyat residents surveyed reported a feeling of being uprooted and long-lasting depression, with many describing leaving the city as losing a part of the soul. They were resettled in cities like Slavati or Kiev, often living in makeshift housing and facing discrimination as radiation victims. Furthermore, the lack of transparency from the authorities caused them to continue using contaminated food and water in the first few days, leading to a 3-fold increase in adult thyroid cancer rates compared to the national average, according to 1995 data from the Ukrainian Ministry of Health. Among the most heavily affected by Chernobyl were children, the most innocent victims, who had no voice and could not protect themselves. Because children's thyroid glands are especially sensitive to iodine-131, a radioactive isotope released from the reactor, thousands of children in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia developed thyroid cancer within a decade of the disaster. A 2016 WHO report documented over 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer in children under 18 at the time of the explosion in the 3 most affected countries, with Belarus having the highest rate. This rate was 50 to 100 times higher than normal. In many cases could have been prevented if potassium iodide pills had been distributed in time to block the absorption of radioactive iodine. In addition to cancer, children born in the affected area also faced congenital disabilities and genetic disorders. A 2001 study from the Belarusian Institute of Genetics reported that the rate of congenital heart defects in children in Gomelta area that received 70% of the radiation from Chernobyl increased by 2.5 times compared to pre-1986 levels. Other issues, such as immune deficiencies, leukemia, and intellectual developmental delays, were also recorded at unusually high rates. These children, along with the offspring of the liquidators, also carried a psychological burden, social stigma, a fear of illness, and a feeling of abandonment by a system that failed to protect them. In 2023, psychological report from Minsk University showed that 35% of children born to Chernobyl-affected families reported anxiety disorders or PTSD, even if they were born after the disaster. The number of deaths from the Chernobyl disaster remains a subject of fierce debate, reflecting the complexity of assessing the impact of a radiation disaster that has stretched over decades. A 2006 official report from the UN and IAEA estimated about 4,000 direct and indirect deaths related to Chernobyl, including 31 immediate deaths and thousands of future cancer cases. However, NGOs like Greenpeace and independent scientists like Dr. Yablokov from Russia argue that the actual number could be much higher, up to 9,999,999,999 when including chronic illnesses, premature deaths from immune deficiencies, and indirect impacts like suicide from depression. This discrepancy comes from the approach to data. Official reports only count clearly confirmed cancer cases, while other studies also consider nonspecific diseases like cardiovascular and respiratory issues, which spiked in the affected areas. Regardless of the exact number, the pain of families who lost loved ones, survivors with incurable diseases, and of a generation with a stolen future is undeniable. A 2025 study from Frontiers in Public Health showed that more than 5 million people in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were directly or indirectly affected by radiation, with 1.2 million people reporting chronic health issues related to radiation. This pain is not only physical, but also mental. Stories of liquidators shunned by society, families torn apart by illness, and children growing up with an invisible fear of an unseen enemy. Chernobyl is not just a technical disaster, but a painful lesson about the value of transparency, responsibility, and compassion. The sacrifice of the liquidators, the pain of the Pripyat residents, and the fate of the children are a reminder that any mistake in managing dangerous technology, like nuclear energy, can lead to irreversible consequences. But have we truly learned the lesson? After Chernobyl, nuclear safety regulations were tightened globally, with the IAEA issuing protocols like the 1994 Convention on Nuclear Safety. However, the 2011 Fukushima disaster showed that there are still gaps in management and crisis response. Furthermore, the lack of transparency in modern disasters from pandemics to climate change shows that humanity is still repeating old mistakes. The question is, how can we measure the pain that spans generations? How can we ensure that the sacrifices of the liquidators and the losses of Pripyat were not in vain? Perhaps the answer lies in constantly reminding ourselves of the value of truth, solidarity, and humanity's shared responsibility in the face of risky technologies. Chernobyl is not just a dark chapter in history, but a call to action to protect future generations. Radiation, the enemy without a face. In horror movies, the enemy often has a specific form: a grotesque ghost, a roaring monster, or a killer lurking in the shadows. But in the story of the Chernobyl disaster, the enemy was an invisible entity that could not be touched, seen, or smelled radiation. It was a silent curse, seeping through the air, soil, and water, spreading death and disease that no one could fight with conventional weapons. As the city of Pripyat was lost in carefree sleep, As firefighters sacrificed themselves in the battle against the fire at Reactor 4, no one knew that the true enemy was still lurking, silently infiltrating every cell, destroying DNA, and leaving consequences that would last for generations. Radiation is not just a physical phenomenon. It is a symbol of human powerlessness against the might of the atom, power we tried to harness, but sometimes lost control of, leading to irreversible tragedies. To understand the terrifying power of radiation, we need to look at its nature and what it caused after the Chernobyl explosion on April 26, 1986. The explosion released a massive amount of radiation, estimated at about 5,200 petabecquerels, equivalent to 400 times the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. According to scientific reports from the IAEA and UNCIR, this radiation included many different isotopes, with a total estimated release of hundreds of PBQ for short and long-term isotopes. This radiation not only affected Pripyat and Ukraine, but also spread across Europe, from Belarus, Russia, to Sweden, Finland, and even further. The main radioactive isotopes released in the disaster iodine-131, strontium-137, and strontium-90, each carried a unique threat, devastating the human body and environment in different ways, but all leaving a deadly mark. These isotopes were released as dust, gas, and particles, spreading through wind and rain, forming giant radioactive clouds covering millions of square kilometers. A 2008 UNCIR study showed that the total global radiation dose from Chernobyl was equivalent to about 600,000 person-sieverts, leading to an estimated thousands of additional cancer cases worldwide. Iodine-131. The silent attacker iodine-131 is a radioactive isotope with a short half-life of about 8 days, making it especially dangerous in the first days after the disaster. It traveled through the air as radioactive dust or vapor, easily entering the human body through breathing or through contaminated food and water, such as milk from cows that grazed on contaminated grass, or vegetables irrigated with contaminated water. Once in the body, iodine-131 accumulates in the thyroid gland, where it emits gamma and beta rays, causing cell damage and increasing the risk of thyroid cancer. Children with their developing thyroid glands were the most vulnerable. After the Chernobyl disaster, the number of thyroid cancer cases in children in Ukraine, Belarus, and neighboring areas skyrocketed. According to the World Health Organization, over 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer were recorded in people under 18 at the time of the disaster, mainly in Belarus, with rates 10 to 100 times higher than before. By 2016, the WHO estimated over 5,000 cases of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents, and this number continues to grow with long-term follow-up studies. Iodine-131, although it only existed in the environment for a few weeks, left legacies that lasted for decades. Studies from the NCI and UNCIR indicate that the risk of thyroid cancer increases with the dose, with an estimated risk factor of about 3.91 per GY in some populations. By 2024, studies in Lithuania, neighboring country, recorded over 5,664 thyroid cancer cases from 1991 to 2015, with the majority related to Chernobyl radiation. Cesium-137. The long-term enemy, Cesium-137, with a half-life of about 30 years, is one of the most persistent threats from the Chernobyl disaster. This isotope dissolves easily in water and is absorbed by plants and soil, thereby entering the human food chain. People who ate contaminated mushrooms, berries, or meat from radioactive animals, like deer or wild boars, unknowingly introduce cesium-137 into their bodies. Once in the body, it distributes evenly in soft tissues, emitting gamma rays that cause cell damage and increase the risk of blood cancer, liver cancer, and cardiovascular problems. After the explosion, cesium-137 spread across Europe, creating radioactive hotspots in Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and even as far as Scotland, where contaminated land and sheep severely affected the livestock industry for many years. By 2025, cesium-137 is still present in the environment, especially in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where the land and forests are still unusable for agriculture or living. According to the IAEA, cesium-137 is the main cause of long-term health problems, with accumulated doses in some areas reaching up to 85 MSV. A 2025 study highlights that cesium-137 remains the biggest threat after 30 years, with half its amount only decaying after 30 years, meaning it will still be significant by 2056. In Europe, countries like Germany and Austria had to ban the harvesting of wild mushrooms for decades due to high cesium concentrations. Strontium-90. The killer in the bone, strontium-90, the half-life of about 28 to 29 years, is another radioactive isotope with devastating power. Due to its chemical structure being similar to calcium, strontium-90 is easily absorbed by the body and accumulates in bones and teeth, where it emits beta rays, damaging bone marrow and increasing the risk of bone cancer, leukemia, and other blood disorders. Children and fetuses, with their developing skeletal systems, are especially vulnerable. After the disaster, strontium-90 settled in the soil and water, contaminating foods like milk, vegetables, and fish. According to a UN report, strontium-90 was the main cause of thousands of leukemia cases in children and adults in the affected areas, with long-lasting consequences. A 2025 report from Frontiers in Public Health emphasizes that strontium-90 contributes to chronic diseases, like blood disorders, with an estimated thousands of related premature deaths. The scariest thing about radiation is that you cannot fight it in the usual way. You cannot shoot it, chop it, extinguish it with water, or shield it with walls. It is like a silent virus infiltrating every cell, destroying DNA, and causing terrible diseases without leaving clear traces. In the days after the disaster, tens of thousands of people in Pripyat and neighboring areas were exposed to high radiation doses, from 52 over 1,000 millisieverts. The first firefighters, like Vasily Ignatenko and Vladimir Provik, were exposed to doses of up to 10 sieverts, enough to cause death in a few weeks due to acute radiation syndrome. But even residents not directly near the reactor, like children playing outdoors or farmers working in the fields, suffered long-term effects from chronic illnesses, congenital disabilities, and cancer. Radiation not only devastates the human body, but also destroys the environment. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, covering 2,600 square kilometers, became a dead zone where the soil cannot be farmed, the water cannot be drunk, and wild animals, like wolves or deer, carry unusually high levels of radiation. The red forest, a forest near the plant, turned reddish-orange as the trees died from radiation, becoming one of the most heavily contaminated areas on the planet. Ironically, the absence of humans has turned the exclusion zone into an accidental nature reserve for wild animals, with the return of bears, lynx, and wolf packs, although they still carry radiation legacies in their bodies. According to ONEP, the exclusion zone is now Europe's third-largest nature reserve, with a thriving animal population. However, a 2025 study shows that the rate of genetic mutations in animals remains high, affecting the food chain. By 2024, the IAEA announced that over 80% of the land around Chernobyl could be used for agriculture with remediation measures. But strontium and cesium are still major barriers. The environmental impact is long-lasting, with projections that most of the area may not fully recover until 2045. The consequences of radiation did not stop at Pripyat or Ukraine. Wind carried radioactive dust across borders, contaminating land and water sources in Belarus, Russia, and all over Europe. According to a report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Chernobyl disaster directly affected more than 5 million people in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, with tens of thousands of premature deaths from cancer and radiation-related diseases. Furthermore, the psychological impact was no less serious. Millions of people lived in fear, lost faith in the government, and faced the stigma of being labeled a Chernobyl victim. A 2025 study indicates that this psychological impact led to a 20 to 30% increase in depression and anxiety rates in the affected areas, according to Frontiers in Public Health. silence, secrecy, and denial. When the Chernobyl disaster erupted as heroic firefighters rushed into the invisible fire at Reactor 4, and as Pripyat's residents were still deeply and ironically asleep, another war was secretly taking place in the shadows of power. It wasn't a battle against deadly radiation or spreading toxic clouds, but a war of silence, systematic concealment, and blatant denial. The Soviet authorities, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, chose to suppress information instead of taking urgent action to save millions of lives. This decision not only aggravated the scale of the disaster, but also deeply scarred humanity's trust in state management systems, especially in the high-risk field of nuclear energy. Decades later, the lessons from this cover-up remain a warning to governments worldwide, a reminder that a suppressed truth can turn an accident into a global tragedy. On the fateful night of April 26, 1986, when the horrific explosion ripped apart Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Soviet authorities did not hesitate to inform the public or the international community. Instead, they chose a thick wall of silence, as if hoping this terrible event would simply vanish into thin air. Local officials, including plant director Viktor Bryakonov and senior engineers, deliberately downplayed the severity. An initial report sent to the Soviet Ministry of Energy in Moscow described the incident as a minor technical malfunction that could be controlled with standard measures. In reality, the reactor was completely destroyed, with its 2,000-ton lid blown off and the uranium core exposed directly to the air. According to a 1986 official report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the amount of radiation released from Chernobyl was about 400 times the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, with over 5,200 petabecquerels of iodine-131 and cesium-137 released into the atmosphere. This horrifying information was kept a state secret. It's only gradually revealed through declassified documents after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The evacuation order for Pripyat home to over 49,000 residents, mostly plant workers and their families, was issued belatedly exactly 36 hours later. At 2 p.m. on April 27, 1986, even then, the announcement was broadcast over loudspeakers in a vague manner, asking residents to leave for a few days and to bring only essential items like documents and a change of clothes. There was no warning about the real danger of radiation, and many residents were not even aware they were living in a dead zone with radiation contamination hundreds of times above safe limits. According to reports by the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, from 2000 and 2011, the radiation dose that Pripyat residents were exposed to during those deadliest 36 hours ranged from 50 to over 1,000 millisieverts, far exceeding the serious injury threshold of 500 MSV and even approaching the acute lethal level. This delay was not just an administrative error, but a systemic crime, leading to thousands of unnecessary exposures, especially in children, the most vulnerable group, increasing their risk of thyroid cancer, leukemia, and genetic disorders that would last for generations. This deadly silence extended far beyond Pripyat, covering neighboring areas like the Gomel province in Belarus and vast rural regions in Ukraine and Russia. People there received no notification about the approaching radioactive cloud. They continued to drink water from the heavily contaminated Pripyat River, eat vegetables and milk from land tainted with cesium-137, and breathe air full of radioactive dust. A comprehensive 2006 WHO study, combined with IAEA data, estimated that if emergency evacuation measures and food consumption restrictions had been implemented immediately, for example, banning the consumption of leafy greens and cow's milk within the first 24 hours at least, 4,000 to 9,000 cases of childhood thyroid cancer across the region could have been prevented. Instead, Belarus, the most heavily affected country, with 70% of the radiation falling on its territory, saw over 6,000 cases of childhood thyroid cancer in the first decade after the disaster alone, according to a 2016 WHO report. One of the most irresponsible and inhumane actions by the Soviet authorities was the decision to hold the May Day parade on May 1, 1986. In Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, just 5 days after the explosion. Kiev is located about 100 kilometers south of Chernobyl, and at the time, the city was covered by the first radioactive cloud, with wind carrying toxic dust from the north. Secret measurements by Ukrainian scientists showed that radiation levels in the air in Kiev exceeded international safety limits by 10 to 20 times, with unusually high concentrations of iodine-131 and cesium-137. Radioactive dust settled on the streets, in parks, and even on the spring flowers. Its senior officials in Moscow, including the Minister of Health and the leaders of the Communist Party of Ukraine, insisted on holding the event to maintain the stable image of the Soviet Union, avoid panic and cover up the incident from the world. Tens of thousands of Kiev residents, including countless children from schools and pioneer camps, were mobilized to participate in the outdoor parade, which lasted for hours under the sun. They marched through the square of the October Revolution, chanting slogans and waving flags, while inhaling radioactive air and directly contacting the radioactive dust on the ground through their shoes and clothes. According to declassified documents from the KGB archives from 1990, officials had received warning reports from local nuclear physicists, but the order from Moscow was clear: do not cancel the event to avoid international suspicion. The consequences of this doomed parade were catastrophic. A 2008 UNSEER report estimated that over 200,000 people in Kiev were exposed to an additional radiation dose of 10 to 50 MSV on that day, contributing to a sudden increase in radiation-related diseases such as thyroid cancer, leukemia, and cardiovascular problems. A 2020 study from Harvard Medical School, based on Ukrainian health data, showed that at least 1,500 additional cancer cases could be directly linked to this event, emphasizing that the priority of image sacrificed the health of a young generation. The world only coincidentally learned about the Chernobyl disaster, thanks to the vigilance and advanced technology of scientists outside the Iron Curtain. On the morning of April 28, 1986, at the Forsmark nuclear power plant on the outskirts of Stockholm, Sweden maintenance workers unexpectedly detected abnormal radiation levels on their clothes and hair when passing through automatic detectors at the exit. Initially, they panicked, suspecting a leak at their own plant. But after careful examination, Swedish physicists determined the source of the radiation came from the east, specifically from the Soviet Union. They immediately notified the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority and international agencies like the IAEA, providing data on characteristic radioactive isotopes like xenon-133 and iodine-131, which could only come from a major nuclear explosion. International pressure quickly mounted like a storm. Other European countries also recorded abnormal signs. Finland detected radiation in rainfall on April 27th. Germany and Austria measured high levels of cesium-137 in the air. Poland and Switzerland reported contamination in cow's milk and vegetables. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl spread northwest, crossing borders and covering about 40% of Europe, from Belarus and Russia to Scotland, Italy, and Greece. According to a 1987 IAEA report, isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 caused long-term contamination of agricultural land, rivers, lakes, and the food chain, with the highest levels in Belarus. The delay in information disclosure from the Soviet Union prevented neighboring countries from taking timely action, did not ban imports of food from the affected area, did not distribute potassium iodide pills to block iodine-131 absorption into the thyroid, and did not evacuate vulnerable rural areas. By the evening of April 28th, under pressure from Western media and calls from the United Nations, the Soviet Union reluctantly acknowledged the incident through a short news report on Central Television, still described it as a minor local accident that was completely controlled, concealing the true scale for many weeks afterward. The explosion at Reactor 4. To truly understand this horrifying story, we need to go back in time and start from where the tragedy began. The control room of Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. On that fateful night, group of engineers and workers, including key figures like Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, young engineers Leonid Topchanov, and Alexander Akimoveth, the shift supervisors stayed up all night to perform a test they believed would prove the superior safety of the plant's system. This test, called the Turbine Safety Test, aimed to check whether the steam turbines could provide enough energy to power the cooling pumps in the event of a sudden power outage, until the backup diesel generators started up and operated fully. However, what unfolded was not just a simple technical mistake, but a chain of disastrous events that led to the largest nuclear disaster in human history. Before diving into the details of the night of April 25th to 26th, 1986, let's explore the Chernobyl plant itself and its core technology. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located about 3 kilometers northwest of the city of Pripyat in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, was built in the 1970s under the Soviet Union. It was part of a large-scale nuclear energy development program to meet the growing electricity demand in the Eastern Bloc. The plant included 4 main reactors, with Reactor 4 completed and put into operation in 1983. The design capacity of each reactor was about 1,000 megawatts of electricity, enough to supply power to millions of households. However, the reactors at Chernobyl were not of the common type used by many Western countries, such as the pressurized water reactor. Instead, they were RBMK-100 reactors, an acronym for Reactor, Bolshoi Mosh, Kanalny in Russian, meaning high-power, channel-type reactor. This was an exclusive Soviet design, developed by scientists at the Kurchatov Institute in Moscow. The RBMK design had distinct features that made it different, and, as many experts later discovered, also full of risks. Instead of using heavy or light water under high pressure for both cooling and reaction moderation, the RBMK used graphite as a neutron moderator, a substance that slows down neutrons to increase the chance of fission. Light water was used as a coolant, flowing through thousands of separate channels containing uranium fuel. An advantage of this design was the ability to replace fuel without shutting down the reactor, increasing operational efficiency and reducing costs. However, it also contained deadly flaws that Soviet engineers at the time were not fully aware of. One of the biggest problems was the positive void coefficient. This meant that when the coolant water boiled and created steam voids, its ability to absorb neutrons decreased, causing the fission reaction to accelerate instead of slowing down. This made the RBMK reactor unstable at low power levels. Below 700 megawatts, thermal a condition that safety regulations strictly prohibited for long-term operation. Furthermore, the control rods in the RBMK had graphite tips, which could temporarily increase the reaction when inserted into the core, rather than immediately reducing it, a design flaw that was only widely revealed after the disaster. The tragedy truly began with the planning of the test. Reactor 4 was scheduled to be shut down for routine maintenance on April 25, 1986. The plant's leadership decided to use this opportunity to perform the turbine test, which had been postponed twice before due to technical issues. The test was intended to simulate a power outage, where the turbine would continue to spin due to inertia to provide power to the cooling pumps for about 45 to 60 seconds, enough time for the diesel generators to start up. However, to perform it, they needed to reduce the reactor power to a low level, around 700 to 1,000 megawatts thermal, but due to a mistake, the power dropped to just 200 megawatts, a dangerous level where the system could become unstable. The night shift team, under Dyatlov's strict command, ignored a series of safety procedures. They disabled the emergency core cooling system, withdrew too many control rods, and ignored warnings about the concentration of xenon-135, a neutron poison generated from fission that further reduces power. This xenon poisoning required waiting 24 to 48 hours for natural decay. But the team tried to increase power by withdrawing more control rods, causing the reactor core to become unusually hot in the lower section. At about 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, the situation spiraled out of control. The control panel in the control room, located on the 4th floor of the reactor building, was flooded with red alarm lights and warning bells. Power suddenly surged from 200 megawatts to thousands of MW in a matter of seconds. Panic spread. Akimov shouted that they were losing control, while Topchinov tried to adjust the water valves. In a last-ditch effort, Akimov ordered the pressing of the AZ-5 button, the complete emergency shutdown button, designed to insert all 211 control rods into the core to absorb neutrons and stop the reaction. This was supposed to be the last resort, but due to a design flaw, the graphite tips of the control rods pushed water out of the channels, creating a void and further increasing the fission reaction. The result was a terrifying power surge, estimated at up to 30,000 megawatts thermal, 10 times the design capacity. The steam pressure inside the reactor skyrocketed, leading to the first explosion at 1 hour 23 minutes and 40 seconds, which blew off the 2,000-ton reactor lid, a massive block of steel and concrete called Alina. This explosion was like a giant pressure cooker bursting, throwing debris and nuclear fuel hundreds of meters into the air. Just seconds later, a second explosion occurred due to a reaction between steam and zirconium in the fuel channels, creating hydrogen and causing a chemical explosion. The entire roof and walls of the reactor building were destroyed, revealing the glowing red core with burning graphite. A column of fire and smoke more than 1 kilometer high shot into the sky, accompanied by a bright blue light, the Cherenkov radiation phenomenon, which occurs when radioactive particles move faster than the speed of light in air or water, creating a ghostly glow that lit up the night sky over Pripyat. The graphite burned at temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius, releasing tons of radiation into the air, including iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90 long-lived radioactive isotopes that can persist for decades and cause cancer and congenital disabilities. The most terrifying thing was not the deafening explosions or the fierce fire, but the radiation, an invisible, odorless, tasteless killer that infiltrated everything. The amount of radiation released immediately was estimated to be 400 times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, equivalent to 5,200 petabecquerels. However, the residents of Pripyat, just 3 kilometers from the plant, with a population of about 49,000, knew nothing. They only heard a strange noise, saw the sky light up for a moment, and then everything returned to a deceptive calm. Many even went out on their balconies to admire the beautiful fire, unaware that the wind was carrying deadly radioactive dust toward them. The Chernobyl disaster was not just a pure technical accident. It was a deadly combination of the inherent design flaws of the RBMK, the lack of transparency in the Soviet system, and human error due to political pressure. Plant leaders were pressured by Moscow to complete the test to prove the superiority of Soviet technology, leading them to disregard safety. That was the price of blind overconfidence, a lack of respect for procedures, and a culture of covering up mistakes under Gorbachev's rule. In just a few minutes of wrong decisions, millions of people were affected. 30 people died within the first 3 months, mostly firefighters and workers, and thousands of cancer cases followed later. Although the reactor had stopped operating, the invisible enemy was unleashed, spreading through the wind to Europe, soaking into the soil, rivers, and waiting to wreak havoc. The first firefighters, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Provik and Major Leonid Telenikov from the Pripyat Fire Department, arrived at the scene just minutes after the explosion. They thought it was just a normal fire on the roof, unaware that every breath they took was inhaling deadly radioactive particles. They bravely climbed ladders, hosing down the burning graphite. But the water only made the situation worse by creating radioactive steam. Many of them died in agony weeks later from acute radiation syndrome, with their flesh rotting and internal organs failing. The firefighters' last stand. The wail of fire sirens tore through the silent night of Pripyat, a familiar sound, but this time it carried a premonition of an unprecedented disaster. It was not a call to a normal fire, but a summons of fate, beckoning brave men to face an invisible enemy that none of them could have anticipated. In the early morning hours of April 26th, 1986, when Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The firefighters from Pripyat and surrounding areas rushed into hell on earth with courage and a sense of duty. However, they had no idea that every step, every breath, was pushing them closer to death. Let's follow Major Leonid Telyatnikov, the 33-year-old commander of the Chernobyl plant's fire department, a man full of passion and experience. He and his team from Fire Unit 2 at the plant received an emergency call at 1:28 a.m., just minutes after the first explosion. At the same time, Fire Unit 6 from the city of Pripyat, commanded by Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, also received the order. In their minds, this was just a big fire at a power plantan incident, not uncommon in an industrial environment. No one told them that the reactor had exploded, that the graphite was on fire, or that the surrounding air was filled with deadly levels of radiation. This lack of information, partly due to the Soviet system's delays and cover-ups, pushed the firefighters into a suicidal mission. When the fire trucks arrived, the scene before them was a surreal picture from hell. Reactor 4's building was torn apart, the roof almost gone, thick black smoke billowing up, and scattered debris of concrete, steel, and nuclear fuel everywhere. A strange blue light, the Cherenkov radiation phenomenon, illuminated the night sky, creating a ghostly but deadly beauty. Despite the unsettling scene, none of them backed down. They were firefighters trained to face danger, and they believed their mission was to extinguish the fire to protect the plant in the nearby city of Pripyat. Telyatnikov, with a determined voice, ordered the team to split into 3 groups. One to climb onto the reactor roof to fight the fire directly. One to enter the turbine hall area, and the last to fight smaller fires from the ground. This was a logical strategy for a normal industrial fire, but in this context, it unintentionally became a death sentence. The team on the roof, including young firefighters like Vasily Ignotenko, Viktor Kibanok, and Vladimir Pravik, faced the harshest conditions. The roof, known as Masha in plant terminology, was littered with hot, glowing graphite fragments. Each piece was an extremely powerful source of radiation, emitting thousands of rongons per hour, enough to kill a person in just a few minutes of exposure. These men were equipped only with standard firefighting uniforms, helmets, and leather gloves. They had no radiation protection gear. They stepped on the graphite fragments, picked them up with their bare hands to throw them off, and hosed the burning reactor core with water. But the water, instead of putting out the fire, made the situation worse. When it hit the graphite, which was hotter than 1,000 degrees Celsius, the water boiled instantly, creating radioactive steam and spreading deadly dust particles into the air. Every breath they took, every drop of sweat that fell, carried millions of radioactive particles into their bodies. After just a few minutes, the first signs of acute radiation syndrome began to appear. Vasily Ignotenko, a 25-year-old firefighter with a bright smile and dreams of starting a family with his wife Ludmila, felt a strange metallic taste in his mouth, as if he were chewing on coins. He and his comrades began to feel dizzy, severely nauseous, and their skin turned bright red as if from a severe sunburn. Some felt a stabbing pain throughout their bodies, as if thousands of needles were pricking their skin. These symptoms were not the result of the fire's heat, but signs of radiation destroying the cells in their bodies. The radiation dose they were exposed to was estimated at 300 to 1,000 rem, while the lethal dose is about 400 rem without treatment. Yet they continued to fight for almost 3 hours, from 1:30 a.m. to around 4:30 a.m. Their courage was not in vain. Telyatnikov and Pravik's teams successfully prevented the fire from spreading to Reactor 3, which was just a few dozen meters away and still operational. If the fire had reached Reactor 3, a second explosion could have occurred, releasing an even greater amount of radiation, turning half of Europe into a dead zone. They also extinguished fires on the roof and in the surrounding area, temporarily stabilizing the situation before specialized military and rescue units from Kiev and Moscow arrived. But the price they paid was unimaginable. When they left the scene, many could no longer walk. Their skin had turned a deep red, Their eyes were blurry, and they were vomiting uncontrollably. Some collapsed on the spot and were dragged by their comrades to ambulances. The firefighters were taken to Pripyat Hospital No. 126, just 3 kilometers from the plant, where doctors and nurses, also uninformed about the danger of radiation, tried to treat them with conventional methods. Intravenous fluids, painkillers, and wound washing. But nothing could stop the devastation of the radiation. Their clothes, shoes, and equipment, heavily contaminated with radiation, were stored in the hospital's basement, a place that would later become one of the most dangerously radioactive areas on the planet, still hot to this day. Realizing the seriousness of their condition, the patients were urgently airlifted to Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, a specialized facility for treating radiation-related illnesses. In Moscow, the doctors faced a medical nightmare. The firefighters, including Ignatenko, Pravik, and Kibanok, were in multi-organ failure. Their skin peeled off in large chunks, their hair fell out completely, and blood flowed non-stop from their mouths and noses. The radiation had destroyed their bone marrow, immune systems, and internal tissues. Some experienced such horrific pain that even the strongest painkillers were ineffective. It's Vasily Ignatenko, who once dreamed of a happy future with his wife and children, died in agony after 14 days, his body almost disintegrating. His wife Ludmila stayed with him until the end, despite the risk of radiation exposure, even though she was not allowed to touch him. All 28 of the first firefighters and workers who were in direct contact with the reactor core died within 3 months, most within 2 weeks of the explosion, leaving behind an inconsolable grief for their families and communities. These firefighters were not just victims of the disaster, but also silent heroes. They prevented a much larger catastrophe, saving millions of lives, but they were not forewarned of the real danger. The lack of information from the plant's management and the Soviet authorities, who were more concerned with national image than human lives, stole their chance of survival. Pripyat, a city asleep. While the firefighters were battling the deadly fire and invisible radiation at Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Just 3 kilometers away, the city of Pripyat was still in peaceful sleep, as if nothing unusual was happening. The narrative of this story, gentle but haunting, leads us into a tragic tableau of naivety, blind faith, and a horrifying truth concealed by a political system. Pripyat was not an ancient town with cobblestone streets or thatched roof houses. Founded in 1970, Pripyat was a modern city. It was built from scratch as a symbol of Soviet progress, dedicated to the Chernobyl plant workers and their families. With a population of about 49,000 in 1986, including engineers, workers, teachers, doctors, and children, Pripyat was the embodiment of the socialist dream. It had multi-story apartment buildings designed in the square Soviet architectural style, wide tree-lined avenues, a lush green park with meticulously trimmed lawns, modern schools, a hospital, a culture center, a movie theater, and an amusement park with a giant Ferris wheel and roller coaster, scheduled to open for the May Day Festival on May 1st, 1986. This city was designed to be a model of ideal life, where children were educated, adults had stable jobs, and everyone believed the future would be brighter. But no one expected that in just one night, Pripyat would become a ghost city, left to the ravages of time and radiation, turning the dream into a permanent nightmare. On the night of April 26, 1986, when the first explosion shook Reactor 4 at 1:23 a.m., most of Pripyat's residents were fast asleep. The explosion, powerful enough to rattle windows in the apartment buildings near the plant, was not enough to wake the entire city. Some residents, mainly families living in the tall buildings near the plant, like the apartments on Lenin Avenue, woke up to the unusual noise or light. They opened their windows, curiously looking out to see a strange blue light, the Cherenkov radiation phenomenon, illuminating the sky and a thick black cloud of smoke rising from the plant. A few people, like Maria Prosenko, Pripyat's chief architect, noted the abnormality and called the plant to ask about it. But the response they received was only vague reassurance. "It's just a minor incident. The fire is under control." Not a single person was informed that a nuclear disaster was unfolding, that the air they were breathing was contaminated with dangerous radioactive isotopes like iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90. According to later estimates, the amount of radiation released into the air over Pripyat immediately after the explosion was equivalent to 5,200 petabecquerels, hundreds of times the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. The radiation level in some areas near the plant, like the Bridge of Death, is up to 1,000 millisieverts per hour, while the safe level for humans is only 0.0001 millisieverts per hour. Radiation, the invisible enemy, colorless, odorless, and tasteless, seeped into every breath, clung to clothes, and permeated the soil, water, plants, and even the food people ate daily. On the morning of April 26th, Pripyat woke up like any other weekend. The sun rose, the sky was strangely clear, and life seemed to go on as normal. Children bounced their way to kindergarten or played in the playgrounds. Young mothers pushed strollers around the central park. The flowers were meticulously planted to welcome the upcoming festival. Couples, many of whom were plant engineers or workers, hurried to catch buses for their morning shift. Some families held outdoor wedding parties, with music and cheers echoing in the air. But no one knew that with every breath, every step, they were being exposed to deadly radiation. Children playing in the sand unknowingly inhaled iodine-131, a radioactive isotope that accumulates in the thyroid gland, increasing the risk of thyroid cancer, especially in children under 15. Breastfeeding mothers, like Ludmila, Ignatenko, wife of firefighter Vasily Ignatenko, did not know that their milk was contaminated with cesium-137, a radioactive substance that can cause organ damage, blood cancer, and other serious diseases. Some residents, especially those living near the plant, noticed the black smoke and a strange metallic smell in the air. They called the plant, or the city government office, but only received reassurance. Everything is under control. No need to worry. The Soviet culture of concealing information, which prioritized protecting the nation's image and the prestige of the Communist Party, prevented the truth from being revealed. Local officials were not allowed to disclose information without approval from Moscow. In the meantime, some curious residents, especially teenagers and young people, gathered on the Bridge of Death, a railway bridge, less than 1 kilometer from the plant, to observe the fire and the strange light. They stood there, chatting, pointing, and even brought their children to see the beautiful sight, unaware that the radiation dose in this area was high enough to be lethal within a few weeks. Some later recalled feeling a metallic taste in their mouths and their skin beginning to burn, but they thought it was just due to the weather or smoke. 36 hours after the explosion, at about 2 p.m. on April 27th, the Soviet authorities finally issued an emergency evacuation order for Pripyat. The decision was only made after scientists from Moscow, led by Valery, Legasov, deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute, flew to the scene and measured the horrifying radiation levels. International pressure also mounted as monitoring stations in Sweden, more than 1,000 kilometers from Chernobyl, detected abnormal amounts of radiation in the air on the morning of April 27th, forcing the Soviet Union to admit the incident. Over 1,200 buses were mobilized from all over Ukraine, lining up on the roads leading into Pripyat. Loudspeakers throughout the city announced that residents needed to prepare for a temporary evacuation for 3 days to ensure safety. The phrase 3 days was repeated, a gentle but deceptive promise that made people believe they would soon return to their homes. They were asked to bring only minimal luggage, a few clothes, personal documents, some money, and small personal items. Pets, large belongings, and anything with a risk of radiation contamination were forbidden, leading to heartbreaking scenes of dogs and cats being left behind, their cries echoing as their owners departed. The evacuation unfolded in a strangely orderly chaos, reflecting the discipline of Soviet society. Mothers held their small children tightly, trying to reassure them that this was just a short trip, like a weekend getaway. Fathers hastily packed items of sentimental value, a wedding photo, a child's favorite toy, or a commemorative book. Some people, like the family of engineer Anatoly Kurguz, even left a note on their door that read, We'll be back in 3 days. They got on the buses, looked out the windows, and saw for the last time the familiar streets, the modern buildings, the park with its flower beds, and the Ferris wheel that had never turned. As the convoy left Pripyat, no one knew they were leaving their entire lives behind. Within a few hours, Pripyat, with its 49,000 residents, became a ghost town. Apartments still had dishes on the dining tables, clothes hanging in closets, books left open on study desks, and unmailed letters. Bicycles lay scattered in yards, dolls were abandoned on park benches, and May Day festival posters still hung on the walls. Everything seemed frozen in time, like a horror movie stopped at the final scene where the main characters never return. The silence that fell over Pripyat afterward was the most terrifying thing. There were no more children's laughs, no more cars on the main avenues, no more music from the culture center or loudspeakers promoting a bright future. There was only the sound of the wind, carrying radioactive dust, and the creak of lonely swings in the park. The Ferris wheel, a symbol of joy and hope, stood silently as a witness to the tragedy. Having never turned a single revolution before the city was abandoned, Pripyat, once a vibrant community with dreams of a bright future, is now a graveyard of shattered memories. The invisible enemy radiation not only stole lives, but also an entire city, a history, a generation. Today, Pripyat is part of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, 2,600 square kilometers area around the plant where radiation levels still make it one of the most dangerous places in the world. Isotopes like cesium-37 with a half-life of 37 with a half-life of 30 years, and strontium-ideers still make the soil, water, and air dangerous for centuries to come. If you visit Pripyat today, you will see a city swallowed by time. Trees grow through concrete, vines wrap around windows, and rusted cars sit still as silent witnesses. On the peeling walls, May Day posters still hang, a reminder of a belief, a festival that was forever lost. In the basement of Hospital No. 126, the clothes and equipment of the first firefighters still lie there, emitting such a dangerous level of radiation that no one dares to touch them. Pripyat is not just an abandoned city. It is a living reminder that technology, when combined with overconfidence and a culture of concealment, can be a double-edged sword. It stole the homes, memories, and futures of tens of thousands of people, leaving a dead zone right in the middle of Europe. So what do you think? Is Chernobyl a lesson we have truly learned, or is it just a dark shadow waiting to be repeated somewhere else? Share your thoughts in the comments. And as you turn off your screen tonight, remember, there are memories the whole world wants to forget. But Pripyat still stands there, as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you cannot see.
You've crossed the story. You felt every pulse in the dark, and I was there with you, quietly, always. That's why I left behind one last thing. Not to explain, not to impress, just to stay with you a little longer. A song I chose with care, as if tucking you in from across time and space. So go on, lay back, the music knows where to take you. still here, then you're something rare. Not many stay this long. So, thank you for choosing to stay. I'm here too, still awake, surrounded by the quiet glow of my editing screen, shaping the next stories just for you. If there's anything you want to leave behind, a whisper, a suggestion, even just a symbol, drop it in the comments. Because maybe, tomorrow night, you'll hear yourself echoed in a story that's never been told before.